Welcome to Web Development Lesson 3.6. In this lesson, we're going to look at a method of approaching a problem and developing everything from the HTML all the way through the JavaScript. We're going to explore some more sophisticated formulas that are going to require us to understand the order of operations, and we're going to see how we can convert these formulas from a mathematical, scientific representation to its JavaScript equivalent. So let's get to it. So before we actually dive into code, I want to show you how we can use like a graphic organizer, which eventually you'll be able to let go once you get a little more comfortable with the whole process. So let's say somebody presented you this problem, this scenario of create a program that calculates the average of 3 grades. So what's our problem? What are we being challenged to do? So we have to, calculate an average of 3 grades. Again, it might seem, self-explanatory by reading the scenario, but trust me, you'd be surprised how quickly you forget what the purpose of your program is once you start coding. So it's nice to be able to identify these things and have them in a place that you can quickly go back and refer to, just in case you do kind of lose your focus as to, what am I doing here? The second question, again, it might seem redundant, and that's really just because of the simplicity of the scenario. So what is our desired outcome? Display the average. What information is required? So this is the first one where it's not as obvious. We might have to think about it a little bit. So what information do we need from the user? Again, if we want to create a program that calculates the average of 3 grades, what do we need? Well, we need 3 grades. So this is an important step to be able to identify what is the information you need from the user from the scenario. And what you're going to see here is that the outcome of one step feeds into the other one. And the first thing we look at within the user interface, the HTML, is, okay, what text inputs are required? The text inputs, again, that's a way for the user to give us some information, so it connects nicely with this. So because we need 3 grades, guess what? We probably need 3 text inputs. So let's write those. And don't forget that when you use a text input, you want to give it an ID. And I'm just going to say grade 1. We also want a placeholder to kind of give the user some information. So we'll say enter grade 1. And that's it. So that's our first one. And I would say, actually, let's write all the HTML here. What you're going to find later on is that once we have this working, we can easily just copy and paste it into Replit. One thing to be careful of when you do copy and paste is to make sure that you change whatever needs to get changed, so it's not the exact same information as the thing that you copied. Okay, so we knew that we needed to ask the user for 3 grades. We have our text inputs to get those 3 grades. And we need a way for the user to kind of initiate the action. And that's where a button comes in. So we'll say input type equals button. A button doesn't necessarily need to get an ID. What it does need, though, is an event listener, which is typically the on-click, because that's what you do with buttons. You click them. Now we need an event handler. So it's really up to you how you decide to create your event handler. I'm going to use a function name called average. And notice we're designating an event handler even though we haven't created the function yet. That's okay. Again, this is kind of like the top down. This is what we would like to have, and we'll develop it later on. A button needs a value, so we can see something actually on the button, and I guess we could just say average for the button. I think we got everything from that. Don't forget, we need to have some area on the screen that we can display our output. And I would definitely suggest keep it simple. Always use the ID of output. and that way you never have to kind of forget or change your code. The element can change. You can make a span, a div, a paragraph, an H1. Doesn't really matter. As long as you have the same ID, your code will look the same once we get to writing the JavaScript. All right, so between these 5 elements, we have our user interface. So now we're ready to start doing the JavaScript. And I'm just going to hit enter a couple times so we get this all on the same page. So what is the name of our event handler? All right, so we saw that from the previous step with the button, we decided to have a function called average. So let's write that down. Okay, so this is our function header. Now these next steps, I mean, they're kind of listed here, and I'm going to do them as separate steps, but really they all go inside the function. So the first thing you always need to have inside your functions are your variables, and there's usually variables associated with any element that has an ID. So let's go ahead and grab our element by ID, and this would be grade 1. Now this grabs us the whole element, the whole text input, but we don't need the whole text input. We just simply need the value from the text input. So here we go, dot value. Now because we're going to do something mathematical with it, it would probably be best for us to parse it. If you recall, text inputs, the information is always of type string, regardless of what gets entered in. All right, so it's our job on the JavaScript side to then go ahead and change it. So I'm going to make it parse float just in case there's decimal numbers inside of our data. All right, so that's our first one, and now we're just going to do it 2 more times. Again, don't forget, little copy and paste means you have to update some of the information. And let's see, that we got. Okay, so notice this matches nicely with our text inputs, which matches nicely with the fact that from the first step, we identified we needed 3 pieces of information. So notice how it all builds into the next step. All right, so we also need our variable for our output. And this is where I was saying if you keep the ID as output, this line never has to change. Because it doesn't really care if the element is a div, a span, a paragraph. It's simply going to grab it. And all the ones that I just mentioned work the same way in terms of being able to do an inner HTML with them. Okay, so this is our first steps. This would all be inside of our function. Now we need our calculation. So we're going to create another variable, and maybe we'll call it AVG. I wouldn't call it average because that is the name that we use for our function. Though JavaScript would probably be okay with having it, it's just horrible. I wouldn't do it. So what is our average? So we have to add up our 3 grades and then divide by 3. Now I'm introducing a logical error here in case you're already noticing what the problem is. Just hold on to it because I want to demonstrate how you can catch some of these things when you're programming your web page. All right, so here's our calculation, and don't forget the last step is always to display your information. If you do not display information, your program's useless. Again, the user wants to see some feedback. And we'll do a little string concatenation of average is plus average, AVG. And there we go. So using this graphic organizer was a great way to kind of get all our thoughts down on a piece of paper. And it's not wasted work. And you'll see why here in a second. So let me go ahead and create a new lesson. And we'll call this WD lesson 3.6. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to put our UI in here. So let's go back to our graphic organizer. Let's grab our text inputs. So we'll copy those, bring it here. That was the only thing that I hated using Google Docs. Notice the quotation marks. They're a little on the funky side. So let's see if we could do a little Control H. Oops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Isn't it Control H? Control G? No. I would hate to have to manually change all of these. There we go, Control H. So let's grab these, put it in here, make these the quotations, and let's do a replace all, and life is good. Somehow I feel like we lost a quotation here. So let's put that one back in. All right, now let's go ahead and grab our button. I guess I probably should have just brought everything in first before I did the replacement of the quotation marks. So let's bring this one in. In fact, why don't I just do that? I'll just bring everything in because something tells me there's going to be other issues here too, other places. So I'm going to create a script area and leave my code on the same page. It might just make it easier for us to kind of adjust from it. So let's grab our function, or if you want to also call it, this is your event handler. I think I indented one too many times, so let's bring it back. Let's go and grab our variables that work with our text inputs. Yeah, see, we got these over here too that we're gonna have to handle. So I think if you start doing this whole idea of copy and paste from a Google Doc or even from a Word document, you're gonna wanna wait to the very end to do that replacement of all those quotation marks. Honestly, I personally don't actually use a graphic organizer. Again, I've had enough practice with this, but the thought process of what goes into developing the application doesn't change. It's just that I personally do it directly on the document, and eventually you will get to that point too. You know, having that extra, step of, let's do replace all. Does that catch it all? I only caught those, so let's grab these. And I think now we are good. Let's take a quick look. All the quotation marks look good. Let's go and bring this over. Let's check it out. All right, so here are our 3 boxes. Here's our button. So we're going to keep it simple. Say 100, 90, 80. The average should be 90. And now you notice it's 216. It's like, that is completely wrong. It's even more than the highest grade, so it can't be an average. So what's happening here? Notice it doesn't give us any errors down here. So according to the program, it thinks everything's correct. This is called a logical error. And now we have to refer back to your math knowledge of order of operations. So looking at this particular statement, we see here that division has a higher order precedence. So the computer is going to do division first. It's going to divide only the last grade, the G3, by 3, and then simply add the other 2. So that's where we got this funky bit. So this ended up being 190 plus whatever 80 divided by 3 is. So if we want to force the computer to do the addition first, we could take, our knowledge of order of operations and realize that parentheses will happen first, and we can force JavaScript to add the grades first and then divide. So let's try that out. And there we go. Now we got our average of 90. I also want to share with you another way that we can approach this. So let's say we want to create another variable. Maybe call it sum. And we simply added the grades first. And then we simply do sum divided by 3. This has the same result because JavaScript will run this line first, add the 3 numbers, take that sum, that one number sum of the 3 grades, and then divide it by 3. Taking this approach is useful sometimes when your calculations are very huge. I would almost recommend, if you have a large formula, don't try to tackle it all in one spot. Break it up into several variables, identify logically which pieces might make sense to put as a variable, as a separate calculation, and then kind of group everything together. All right, so let me prove to you that this does work. So I'm going to run it again, and we'll use another set of numbers. So we'll say 90, 80, 70, and we got 80. So the use of, or your understanding of order of operations is essential when converting formulas from their mathematical representation to JavaScript. Again, what might look a certain way when depicted in a math problem might not translate nicely. You have to understand that certain things need to happen first. And so let's go back to our presentation and let's review what we've covered today. We definitely spent a lot of time talking about program development, these different steps of problem analysis, user interface, and then ultimately the JavaScript. How your work in one area will help you with the next area. It all ties in together. And the more you practice this, the easier it becomes. It'll become second nature. You don't have to actually refer to a graphic organizer. Order of operations is essential when converting formulas. Again, math problems and science problems in textbooks and on websites will be depicted a certain way. But you have to understand what the implied operations are and the implied order of the operations are, because sometimes they're not as obvious because they're written a certain way in a math book or a science book. So hopefully you enjoyed lesson 3.6. This is your first video where you're hopefully feeling empowered that you can actually create something that can be of use to somebody. Enjoy.